In the deserts of North Africa, the wind carried more than sand. It carried lies, half-truths, and fatal illusions. And no one knew this more painfully than the man the Allies once feared above all others, Erwin Rommel, the Desert Fox. But behind the legend was a secret the German High Command tried to bury. That Rommel's brilliance could only shine when Berlin's intelligence machine didn't sabotage him. On the eve of his greatest defeats, the reports on his desk were confident, precise, and catastrophically wrong. A phantom British army, a fuel supply that never arrived, tank divisions that existed only on paper. As the desert sun rose over Alamein, Rommel whispered to an aide, "Intelligence has failed us. We are blind." This is the story of how one commander, trapped by his own side's misinformation, watched the Afrika Korps' fate collapse, not because of enemy genius, but because of the silent betrayal of German intelligence. February 1941. The Libyan desert shimmered beneath a white sun as a new commander stepped onto the North African front, an officer whose name was still only a footnote outside military circles. General Erwin Rommel, newly appointed leader of the Afrika Korps, arrived with a reputation for speed, daring, and an unbreakable belief in momentum. The men who watched him in those first days remembered a figure constantly in motion, binoculars around his neck, boots dusted with sand, eyes fixed on the horizon as if the next battle were already unfolding there. Germany had sent him to stabilize Italy's collapsing position in Cyrenaica. What they received instead was the birth of a legend. Within weeks, Rommel launched a lightning counteroffensive. At Mecheli and Derna, his armored spearheads shattered British positions that had seemed untouchable just days earlier. By early April, he was driving toward Tobruk, pushing Allied forces into a defensive shell while Berlin marveled at the speed of his advance. To his troops, these victories felt effortless, almost predictable. But behind the sweeping successes lay an invisible architecture of intelligence and its early fractures. Rommel's headquarters relied on a mosaic of sources: the Abwehr, Luftwaffe reconnaissance units, signals officers stationed hundreds of miles from the front, and analysts in Berlin who studied maps without ever breathing desert air. Every night, couriers delivered fresh reports and aerial photographs, offering snapshots of supply lines, British dispositions, and estimated troop morale. Yet even in these early months, the cracks were already widening. Aerial photography often arrived days late, blurred by the harsh desert glare or distorted by shifting dunes. Overconfident analysts in Berlin insisted the British were suffering a total collapse, drawing conclusions from scraps of information and assumptions about Allied disorganization. Many intelligence officers had never spent a single hour in the North African wilderness. They didn't understand how the terrain concealed movement, how a retreating British column might simply be shifting to the next defensive ridge. Inside his command tent outside Tobruk, Rommel paced over maps that were more guesswork than ground truth, lines drawn from incomplete reconnaissance, arrows based on reports that were optimistic at best and dangerously misleading at worst. His staff remembered how he would tap a finger against the edges of British defenses, studying the desert like a puzzle to be solved by sheer willpower. Success became its own trap. The victories at Mecheli and Derna convinced Berlin that Rommel possessed an almost intuitive genius, that he could outmaneuver the British without perfect information. Each triumph hardened a dangerous belief: Rommel didn't need the truth. His instinct would win the war. But desert warfare was unforgiving, and the intelligence picture that had once seemed sufficient now concealed a fatal misunderstanding. As Rommel planned his next offensive, new reports arrived, confident, assertive, and entirely wrong. They claimed the British were exhausted, undersupplied, and incapable of mounting any significant attack. Fuel shortages, broken morale, collapsing logistics, all presented as near certainties. Rommel circled a point on the map with the tip of his pencil. "We move at dawn," he said. He didn't know that miles away, the British already knew his intentions, down to the hour. In theory, the German war machine prided itself on precision. But behind the sharp edges of its armored divisions and the disciplined cadence of its infantry lay an intelligence network fractured by rivalry, politics, and wishful thinking. Nowhere was this dysfunction more visible or more devastating than in North Africa. Rommel never fought the British alone. He fought them with a blindfold tied by his own intelligence services. At the center of this tangled web stood the Abwehr, led by Admiral Wilhelm Canaris. It was supposed to be Germany's premier strategic intelligence service. But by 1941, Canaris's organization was increasingly mistrusted in Berlin, operating under layers of political suspicion and internal sabotage. Meanwhile, the German army's own analytical branch for foreign forces, Fremd hier Afrika, worked independently, often producing assessments that clashed with the Abwehr's conclusions. Overlaying these was the Luftwaffe's aerial reconnaissance arm. Their pilots flew long-range sorties over Cyrenaica and Egypt, capturing vital images of British supply dumps, tank parks, and convoy movements. But the raw photographs had to survive a chain of analysts, each pressured to present results that would reinforce German confidence, not reveal German vulnerability. And then there was the Nazi Party's political intelligence, a shadow network that filtered battlefield realities through ideological expectations. Reports were measured not by accuracy, but by how well they echoed Hitler's belief in German superiority. Even local Italian reporting, often the closest to the ground, was sidelined, dismissed by German officers who viewed their allies' assessments as overly cautious or pessimistic. The result was chaos. Agencies overlapped, competed, and in some cases deliberately falsified numbers. When Hitler demanded signs of British collapse, those signs appeared on paper, even when the desert told a different story. Meanwhile, the British enjoyed a weapon the Germans didn't even know existed: Ultra. Through the breaking of the Enigma cipher, Allied commanders had a window into German communications with astonishing clarity. They knew Afrika Korps supply levels, divisional strengths, and even the daily state of Rommel's fuel reserves. Where Rommel worked from reconnaissance up to 72 hours old, the British often had intelligence updated by the hour. The imbalance was catastrophic. In 1942, a single analytical failure exposed the scale of the German problem. Multiple German branches reported that British armored strength in Egypt had fallen dramatically. Some estimates claimed the Eighth Army had barely 200 operational tanks. In reality, British forces possessed more than 700 additional tanks beyond German estimates. When Rommel launched operations believing he had numerical superiority, he was unknowingly driving into an armored wall. His frustration was hardly concealed. Staff officers recorded moments when he would slam a folder shut, exasperated by the rosy projections drifting in from Berlin. "Berlin sends fantasies, not facts," he muttered more than once, according to his adjutant. His diary entries grew sharper, more skeptical, peppered with complaints about reports written for political comfort, not military truth. And then there was the fuel crisis, a recurring torment. German logistics repeatedly promised fuel convoys that never arrived. Some were sunk by British submarines and aircraft. Others were delayed or simply misreported as delivered. Intelligence summaries insisted that incoming supplies were sufficient for major offensives, even as Rommel's tank commanders were siphoning the last drops from damaged vehicles. Increasingly, Rommel fought not with intelligence but with intuition. Berlin punished officers who contradicted Hitler's optimism, so Rommel learned to stop asking for honest assessments. The truth had become politically dangerous. One evening in late 1941, as he studied yet another Berlin report describing the British Eighth Army as badly damaged, a distant sound rolled across the desert, a low, growing vibration. Engines. many of them. British engines. Thousands of vehicles were massing for Operation Crusader. Rommel set the report aside and listened. "They know everything," he whispered. "We know nothing." By mid-1942, the North African campaign had reached its razor's edge. Rommel's advance toward Egypt had carried the Afrika Korps farther than anyone in Berlin believed possible. From Gazala to Mersa Matra, German and Italian units fought with a speed that stunned the British. But every kilometer eastward stretched supply lines thinner and pulled Rommel deeper into a trap he couldn't see. Fuel was the lifeblood of desert warfare, and Rommel was nearly out of it. Weeks of intercepted convoys, bombed ports, and lost tankers had drained his reserves to the point where even successful attacks stalled for lack of gasoline. Yet German intelligence summaries arriving from Berlin told a different story. They described the British Eighth Army as demoralized, disorganized, and clinging to Egypt with only limited armored reserves. Rommel wasn't convinced. He turned to General Fritz Bayerlein, his chief of staff, and spoke with unusual bluntness. "Their numbers do not match what Berlin claims." Bayerlein agreed. Local reconnaissance painted a far more dangerous picture, but those warnings rarely traveled beyond Rommel's desert headquarters. Higher commands filtered them out, either from wishful thinking or fear of contradicting Hitler's optimism. Across the front line, the British held a weapon that made the imbalance fatal. Through ultra-decrypts, General Bernard Montgomery's staff read German supply reports as if reading Rommel's diary, as one British officer later described it. They knew convoy losses. They knew fuel stockpiles. They knew exactly how many operational tanks the Afrika Korps possessed. And by the time Rommel approached the fortified line at El Alamein, Montgomery understood that his opponent was dangerously overstretched. Dust storms battered the desert through September and early October. Columns of sand rolled across the battlefield like moving walls, grounding aircraft and hiding entire armored formations. German fuel convoys were ambushed so regularly that drivers prayed simply to make it halfway before British aircraft found them. One extended supply route stretched more than 1,500 kilometers from Tripoli to the front, a logistical impossibility for an army relying on trucks already worn from months of hard desert use. German tanks, especially the Panzer III and IV models, could maneuver brilliantly in open terrain, but without fuel, mobility became meaningless. Mechanics were forced to cannibalize entire platoons of tanks just to keep a handful running. And intelligence was failing at the exact moment Rommel needed it most. German analysts insisted that Montgomery had roughly 55 operational tanks ready for the coming battle. That figure passed from Berlin to Rome, then to Panzer Army headquarters, treated as near certainty. But ultra-decrypts gave the British the advantage of truth. Montgomery had nearly 600 tanks ready for combat, more than 10 times what German intelligence claimed. On the night of 23 October 1942, the truth announced itself with fire. At precisely 9:40 p.m., the desert erupted. Nearly 900 British and Commonwealth guns opened fire along a 40-mile front. The bombardment was so intense that some German officers believed the ground itself was breaking apart beneath them. Artillery flashes turned the night sky white. Shockwaves rolled through command posts. Rommel's staff officers froze, staring toward the horizon as the British barrage marched steadily forward. Rommel wasn't even present when the storm began. He had traveled to Germany for medical treatment and consultations, and by the time he returned, the Afrika Korps was battered, depleted, and surrounded by forces outnumbering them 4-1. The German-Italian line was already buckling. Ammunition was rationed. Fuel was nearly gone. Entire battalions had been reduced to remnants. Human cracks appeared as quickly as the tactical ones. Wounded soldiers shouted bitter accusations at headquarters. "They lied to us," said the British were finished. Officers burned sensitive documents in metal barrels outside field headquarters. Radio operators, The same men who had spent months intercepting fragmented British messages now listened in disbelief as British units coordinated their assault with perfect clarity. Psychologically, the Afrika Korps had reached its breaking point. As one officer wrote after the war, "Berlin sends us optimism, Montgomery sends us artillery." By early November, there was no choice left. Rommel ordered a full retreat from El Alamein. Vehicles withdrew in long, thin columns across the desert while British armor pressed relentlessly behind them. The dream of reaching the Suez Canal was over. The priority now was survival. A junior staff officer approached Rommel as preparations for withdrawal unfolded. "What happened here, Herr General?" he asked. Rommel looked toward the burning horizon. "We lost the battle before it began," he said, "the moment truth stopped reaching this headquarters." By early 1943, the sands of North Africa had become a graveyard for illusions. The Afrika Korps, once the swift spear of German ambition, was reduced to a shadow of its former self. Defensive lines that had been hastily thrown across the Libyan-Egyptian frontier now buckled under relentless Allied pressure. Rommel, the Desert Fox, was no longer advancing with daring maneuvers. He was retreating, often blindly, against an enemy whose strength had been systematically underestimated by his own intelligence. Reports from Berlin promised supplies that never arrived. Convoys supposedly carrying 5,000 tons of fuel had staggered forward at a fraction of that. Only 400 tons reached the front, and much of that had been destroyed or stolen along the way. Luftwaffe reconnaissance photographs, which could have offered glimpses of British troop movements or supply concentrations, were frequently misinterpreted, delayed, or ignored. And Hitler, still confident in German omnipotence, refused to allow any tactical withdrawal, relying on intelligence that insisted the British Eighth Army was on the verge of collapse. Rommel's private correspondence with his wife, Lucy, reveals the human toll of this systemic failure. Letters are filled with exhaustion and frustration, phrases like "sent into the desert without eyes" punctuating the margins, exposing a commander forced to navigate a battlefield he could scarcely see. Every decision was shadowed by doubt, every plan undermined by incomplete or falsified information. His strategic vision, once bold and fluid, now strained under the weight of misinformation. On the front, the human cost was visible in every sand-blown foxhole. Wounded soldiers littered makeshift hospitals, their cries a constant reminder of promises Rommel had been unable to keep. "I'm sorry," he admitted to his men, unable to hide the frustration in his voice. The battlefield was not just a measure of tanks and artillery. It was a testament to misled courage, to men risking everything on directives that had been distorted by politics and hope. Rommel's fury and despair found voice in one of his most damning statements to General Hans-Eugen von Westphal: "I command an army of lions led by blind men in Berlin." The words capture the paradox of North Africa, an elite, disciplined, and determined force stymied by flawed reports, overconfidence, and political interference. Every lost village, every abandoned supply dump, every failed counterattack was a symptom of a command structure where reality had been subordinated to ideology. As the Afrika Korps continued to collapse under sustained British pressure, surrender became inevitable. Units that had once embodied rapid maneuver and tactical ingenuity now fell apart, encircled and overwhelmed. Rommel, the architect of daring advances across the desert, faced the bitterest defeat not merely from superior enemy forces, but from the illusions propagated by his own command hierarchy. When he finally boarded a transport plane back to Germany, it was not the British artillery, tanks, or ultra-decrypts that weighed on him most. It was the realization that he had been fighting a war defined as much by lies as by firepower, defeated not by the enemy, but by the illusions of his own leadership. When Rommel returned to Germany in early 1943, he brought with him more than the scent of desert dust and the echoes of battle. He carried the weight of failure imposed not by superior enemy forces, but by the illusions woven through his own command. In Berlin, he demanded an audience with Hitler, hoping to secure reinforcements, or at the very least, permission to withdraw the remnants of the Afrika Korps from North Africa before the collapse became total. Hitler listened with a fixed expression, then cited new intelligence reports, insisting that the British Eighth Army remained disorganized and overstretched, vulnerable to renewed offensives. Rommel, his patience worn thin by months of misinformation, responded sharply. Historical records confirm his words. The intelligence Berlin relied upon was fantasy. He outlined the shortages, the shattered supply lines, the exhausted troops, and the British strength he had witnessed firsthand. Yet the Führer's dismissal was absolute. Optimism, not reality, guided his decisions. This confrontation marked a turning point for Rommel. He began to understand that the regime he had once served with unreserved loyalty was incapable of facing truth. The same structures that had delayed or distorted information in North Africa were embedded across the Wehrmacht and Nazi bureaucracy. Over time, this recognition contributed to Rommel's growing disillusionment and his quiet association with anti-Hitler officers who would later plot to remove the Führer from power. Allied historians would later conclude that Rommel's defeat was as much an intelligence collapse as a military one. Ultra-decrypts had given Montgomery a near-complete picture of German dispositions, while Rommel's reports were filtered, delayed, or outright falsified by competing German agencies. The Desert War, often romanticized as a duel of skillful maneuver and daring leadership, was in truth dictated by the clarity of information, something Rommel increasingly lacked. Rommel did not fear the enemy. He feared the silence of truth. The desert had shown him brilliance in action, audacity in command, and the courage of his soldiers, but it had also revealed the deadly cost of decisions made on wishful reports, bureaucratic optimism, and deliberate deception. In the end, the irony was cruel. The man celebrated for his clarity of vision, the desert fox who read landscapes, supply lines, and enemy dispositions with uncanny precision, was undone by a blindness imposed upon him from afar. His legacy was not simply victory or defeat. It was a warning, etched not in monuments or medals, but in the ruins of the Afrika Korps, and in the stark lesson that even the greatest commander cannot fight what he cannot see.